questioning is perhaps the greatest gift we have as human beings.
Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking.
It's a way of thinking that teaches us to question everything we think we know.
Science came about by developing techniques, methodologies for gaining reliable knowledge about the world.
We have at our fingertips the technologies that were only possible for the largest governments and corporations 20 years ago as an individual today.
If the human civilization continued at anything remotely like the current pace of technology advancement for a million years, where would we be? I think we're either extinct or on a lot of planets.
The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it.
We hold the scientific method in high regard because it works. If it stopped working, we'd throw it out.
Discover the past.
Create the future.
This is the Here and How podcast.
Welcome to the Here and How podcast, where every week we dive deep into big ideas, exploring the past so we can create the future. My name is Rachel Oates, and this is episode 12. Do we have a sixth sense? With me today are two wonderful guys, Thomas Westbrook.
Hello.
And Stephen Woodford.
Why, hello all.
So, how are you guys doing today? Are you feeling good?
I'm feeling ready,
Yeah?
ready for another episode.
Yeah?
I'm feeling really good.
Mhm.
Is that
Yeah.
the transition into the
Yeah. That's what I'm going with. I didn't know how to open it, so I was just like something about feeling and
I
sensing.
beat the horse out of the crate.
Wait,
Well, now it
what?
sounds like I'm an animal abuser.
Apparently you are.
Very much so.
I do not get that reference, so I'm just gonna move on from it and
let's
pretend I'm
it
not
never
dumb.
happened.
Yeah. Okay, so today we are talking about the senses, kind of how we perceive the world around us, how we get that information, and how many senses do we actually have? So, guys, how many do you think we have?
More than 5.
I see dead people.
You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say 5, and then I go, aha!
I'm going to say 12.
Okay.
12, 15 kind of thing.
Okay, interesting.
But
I'd
really,
say-
I guess it depends on how you define sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a big question we're going to be looking at today.
Mm.
More
So-
than 5 traditional, but I think some can be lumped together depending on how you classify them.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Okay. Oh, you guys are just doing all my work for me here. Like, why am I even here today? No, but seriously. So everyone knows the 5 traditional senses, right? And I know this is quite a tough one. You guys might not remember this from school, but what are they?
Hatred,
Yeah.
hunger.
Yeah.
AIDS.
Did you say AIDS? Oh my God. Guys!
Oh, wait.
don't be on the
Senses that everyone has. I thought we were talking about things that Steve had.
Oh, come on! It's true, you know. And my aids are you two. You're aiding me in this podcast.
This is going to be one of our dumb tangents, but I actually knew an ear doctor who had a patient that came in that checked off on like the list of like medical conditions that you have. She checked that she had AIDS, and it was like this 80-year-old woman. And he's like, just to be clear, you know, like he's wondering if he needs to wear like extra gloves or be extra careful or something. It's like, it says here that you have AIDS. And she's like, of course I do. I have 2 of them, 1 in each ear.
Oh, bless her. Oh my God, that's the cutest.
Yep.
That is so cute.
But no, so hearing, touch, sight,
Perception, eyes, yep.
smell,
Mm-hmm.
and sniffing.
You said smell.
You can't say you've got a sense of smell and you've got sniffness.
Oh, I said smell already. All right, taste.
Yeah.
Taste.
But I
There
mean, a
you
big
go.
part of taste is like scent anyways, so.
That's another thing
Yeah.
we're going to be touching on, actually, like how they're connected and things like that. We'll get into that in a minute. So, 5 traditional senses, right? Except it might not be so simple, as you guys have said. You've been throwing around numbers like 12 and 15, and 12 is kind of like one of the big numbers in the world of senses. So, back at the beginning of the 20th century, this guy, Rudolf Steiner, who was a philosopher and a science nerd, and he gave loads of really cool talks about stuff, he suggested we have 12 senses. Personally, I'd argue that a lot of the ones he kind of said we have are more like sub-senses of the 5 traditional ones. But it's an interesting idea, and I was wondering, do you guys have any idea what those 12 might be? Bearing in mind 5 are the traditional senses, so what do you think the other 7 are?
I remember quite a while ago, I have seen this guy's work, but it's such a long time ago that I don't remember the rest. But I know that heat was one of them, and I found that quite compelling, because the way he described exactly how we perceive heat, it really is sufficiently different to how we feel touch that at the time, I don't know if I would now, I thought that was a relatively compelling argument. What other ones would there be?
I would say proprioception, like your sense of your body's location in space. So like if you close your eyes, you can still touch your nose with your fingers.
He didn't actually list that as one, but he kind of listed the parts of it as 2 under movement and balance.
Right.
Yeah.
Balance. So balance is one of the senses.
Yeah, balance is 1 and movement is 1. So we're on 8 at the minute.
A sense of time?
No, he didn't actually. That is one we're going to touch on later, but that's not one of the ones he said.
Nociception.
What's that?
A sense of pain.
That's touch, isn't it?
Yeah, again, he listed that under touch. And also a little bit under the 9th one, which is life. He said we have a sense of life, which is just like this internal feeling of well-being and health and just being aware of being alive. So I guess
this is weird because like I've seen these lists of like extra senses that people have, but like a lot of the ones that I've seen listed as, you know, additional senses are not on his list.
Yeah. It's
the thing is, like, you know what you just said about nociception? Well, that would encompass touch as well as pain because it's to do with nociceptors. So it's really difficult, I guess. Like we have to define language to use and then use it.
But I think like with touch, you're sensing pressure. You're feeling an object. Whereas with pain, you're actually like experiencing like a sharp, sensation.
Well, really, no. So you could say that when you touch something, say the end of a pin, that's the sensation of touch because you can feel it. Whereas if you push too hard, it hurts you. It's still feeling. It's just you went too far, which is why you've evolved feeling in the first place.
But it's different. It's different receptors, though, and it's kind of like saying that you have a different sense for pain and pleasure. Yeah, you're experiencing something positive or negative, but like with pleasure, it's your brain is releasing dopamine and there's a reward center in your brain that's going crazy, and oftentimes it happens even before you have, like, if you're excited about eating ice cream, your brain will release dopamine in anticipation of the ice cream even right before taking the first bite of it. So it's an interesting classification. I guess you could say that they're both pain and pressure are both part of touch.
What did you say they were different in? You said they are different because they're both from nociception in the sense that they are, I lack the language to be able to convey what I'm trying to say, but they're, in both cases, there's a part of you that's being touched. Are you saying there's a difference in the chemicals that are released by the mind?
Yeah, well, it's a difference in how your brain interprets it. Like with pleasure, it's not as a result of touch. It can be like touch can trigger a release of various endorphins, positive.
So I think what I'm trying to get at is that
to.
If you say that if we decide that a sense ultimately is how the brain conceives it, then everything's the same sense, or there are no senses, or there's an infinity amount of senses because the mind will perceive things differently. Whereas if we put it down to what that organ or what that biological thing has to it needs to do, language here getting in my way, then we can say that we have sight because that is the locus of that is the eye, even though really it's the brain is that does it. But if you can't say that for touch and certain types of touch and not also apply it to basically every sense and every way in which we use those senses. Am I making sense?
Well, where I would make a distinction is you're talking about how the brain interprets all of the sensations, all of the qualia that we experience. I'm saying like we have different receptors for these different things that provide the qualia for the brain to interpret. So when you have different receptors for pressure versus pain versus heat and temperature.
So can you correct me where my very rudimentary knowledge is failing me? When you touch a spike, yeah, go on, Rachel, if you want to jump in.
I was going to say, I think the difference between, like, say, pain and pleasure is that we have specific pain receptors that are aware of pain, that react to pain, and so, like, the point of contact is different, whereas with something like pleasure, it's all in the brain, and it takes information from a number of different receptors in the first place, so pressure and warmth and different things like that all come together to create pleasure, whereas pain has its own receptors and its own area in the brain.
Yeah,
which is how
I think what it is that if nociception relates to your pain receptors, then it is your pain receptors is what feels heat. Your pain receptors is what feels something that's nice. It's also what feels something that's horrible. But the feeling itself is caused by, let's say, receptors in the brain. But if we're talking about the sense of nociception, then the locus is in the feeling, not in the mind, and therefore you can say anything that's touch is nociception. That's at least where my mind's gone. But I'm jumping too far.
The word nociception itself specifically refers to pain.
So in that case, the sense would be just touch. If we're being really basic, the sense would be touch, which results in nociception as one of a number of things. Like
also, if nociception does mean pain, then it's more of a state of being rather than a sense.
But
because
it's not.
You can get pain from seeing something. So would you call that nociception?
I would say that's a little bit different because there's different types of pain. You have, kind of emotional pain and sorrow versus
in the body,
actual nociception.
Yeah, but even in the body, we have 3 different types of pain receptors, which all respond to different things. If that makes sense.
Well, the clarification I would make between touch and pain is that you don't necessarily have to, like, I can physically touch something that is hot, and the heat receptors trigger pain because it's causing damage to your body. But at the same time, I can also experience something internally that I'm not reaching out and touching, like, and feeling pressure or something, as an external sensation. But I could have, say, a heart attack, or have something that causes internal pain.
Okay, I've got a way to get to this. Get to this obliquely. Have you ever had a dream where you've hurt yourself? Where in your dream there isn't a correlation with real life either. It's not like you knocked your knee in real life, or someone knocked your knee, and in your dream you knocked your knee, which of course that does happen. But rather you've just had a dream and someone stabbed you or something along those lines. It feels very, very real. Does that count as your senses, or must it actually happen? Because that will distinguish where the locus of the sense is. Because if it is the pain receptors, as I understand, the nociceptors have to have some kind of interaction, then no, that isn't a sense. Whereas,
but it's all interpreted.
If it's something else.
Yeah.
It's all interpreted by your mind. So, like, vision, for example,
I know that. Yeah,
is interpreted in the mind. You see colors as it's generated by the brain. But at the same time, you can have something like a phantom limb that you amputate, and the person can still feel the phantom limb. They can still feel sensations on it. They can still feel, that it feels like cold, or it feels like it's painful. And if you have a phantom limb that is like clenched up, they can actually feel the pain of this phantom limb that doesn't even exist anymore. There's no receptors technically. At that point, it's all in your mind. But at the same time, you can do something to the real arm, and you can hit it or smack it or poke it or something. And there are actual physical sensations that are triggering, that are linked up to the brain in order to generate physically. It's not psychosomatic. It's actually a physical, physiological effect that's happening. You can feel it both psychosomatically and physiologically, but to say that it's not a physiological component, or that there isn't one component, I think is way off.
Yeah. Well, this is actually really interesting, because this kind of leads me on to my next part. So just very quickly to finish off that Steiner bit, the other kind of senses he predicted, and we'll talk about these more in a minute, were language, thought, and ego. So the complete list was touch, life, movement, balance, smell, taste, vision, warmth, hearing, language, thought, and ego. Language, yeah. So this is about hearing and perceiving language and being able to make sense of it. It's different to hearing, because it's not just an input of sound waves. It's noticing that those sound waves mean something.
Oh, I'm not gelling well with these. I'm not gelling well with this at all.
Yeah, so it's tough. So this kind of leads me on to my next question of like, if this is his way of defining the senses, and we have other ways of defining senses, like, what is a sense? Is it specifically related to a receptor or an organ or like a physical area? For example, sight is related to eyes because it's about taking in light waves, even though all the interpretation of it goes on in the brain and like the brain converts it to pictures. It's the eyes that take in the light waves in the first place. Same with hearing. It's related to the ears because they take in the sound waves. With touch, we have like receptors on the skin for pressure, heat, pain, and that sort of thing. So I found a couple of little definitions of sense online, and I'd just kind of like to get your opinion of how accurate you think these are. Do you think we could improve it? How would you define sense and things like that? So the first one is a faculty by which the body perceives an external stimulus, one of the faculties of sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. And a second definition that I found was, a sense is a physiological capacity of organisms that provides data for perception. So with those in mind, how would you define sense?
I'd be more inclined towards the second one.
Can you give me the first one again?
Yeah. So the first one was a faculty by which the body perceives an external stimulus, whereas the second one was a physiological capacity of organisms that provides data for perception.
Interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Thomas. Carry on.
Wait, so the first one is just saying that it's a faculty for experiencing.
It's basically saying a sense is the perception of an external stimulus, whereas the second one is saying it's a physiological thing that collects data for us to perceive.
I don't know if I got that from the first one, because the word faculty implies that it is a physiological faculty, such as the eyes, such as the touch, even though that's not a thing. You'd have to put that down to basically your skin, which is an enormous organ. But
So, I don't know, would you add anything to these definitions? Would you change them? Like, what would you say a sense is, if you were asked?
See,
I would say I don't know.
It's really tricky because, I would say that there are things that we feel, we experience, we have kind of a not necessarily a physical sensation of, but at the same time, like I would lump in, I would say that time, that we do have kind of a sense of time. We can tell that, there's a passing of time. We can count at, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi or whatever, and try to figure out how much time has passed. We, it feels very different to be right now than it did 10 years ago. But there's no, there's not really a physiological thing that is acting on us in that way. Like, we're not actually feeling time push against us.
I think where the mind comes in really makes this complicated as well, because if we take, for example, you can see us now on screen and you can hear us, etc. It's not what it seems to be, even though we've all evolved to experience the world the same way. Our senses, if you will, bring it in. Key word, of course. The world is not anything like the way well, it is like fundamentally, but it's not in its details anything like the way we experience it. Most solid objects are empty. They're atoms. There's nothing in it basically at all. It's like a fly inside of a football stadium. That's how much mass is in it, and yet we just don't see it that way. So it's really interesting to say that it's that our senses feed us data about the world, and yet our senses are stupendously incorrect in detail, but correct fundamentally.
Well, but I mean, you can have, they're still feeding you data. Whether or not it's a complete data set is a whole nother story. You look at the spectra that we can see, the visual spectrum, and it is absolutely tiny compared to the infrared and ultraviolet rays that we're unable to detect with our eyes. And does that mean that we're not getting data? Does that mean that, we're not getting more data than if we had our eyes poked out? It just means we have an incomplete data set.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, I would say our senses haven't evolved to be able to conceive that data at all. We just haven't evolved to need it, and therefore we don't have a sense for that. So where insects can sense ultraviolet, humans typically can't.
Part of that is that we evolved to live in what Richard Dawkins calls middle world. We're not the super, super small, but we're not the super, super large. And those scales can get so astronomically huge and astronomically tiny. I guess not astronomically, but what would you call it for
microscopic,
atomically tiny, or subatomically tiny, where you get down to this level of we don't see electrons because on a day-to-day level, electrons aren't interacting with us at the level that we're not having to dodge an electron flying through space, and if we don't see it, it's going to kill us or something. We don't really have to see it in order to be a functioning human being. And so as a general result, we can't see anything that tiny. Now, not to mention the physical limitations there. A photon isn't going to be, bouncing off of an electron like that, just because of, scale impossibilities, physical impossibilities. But at the same time, you have, we have evolved to see things around us that, affect us, that are, we can see the physical spectrum of light because it helps us on a day-to-day basis to navigate around different objects, to be able to tell what different objects are. But, I think if we lived in a world where everything was, radioactive and trying to kill us, and we needed to see that, maybe we'd mutate an ability to see it. I don't know.
Yeah. There's every reason to think that we wouldn't. Well, there's every reason to think that if we didn't get wiped out by something like that, then we would evolve towards it. So
and, there are animals that can see in a wider spectrum, that have better night vision as a result of it, because they're nocturnal and stuff. And but at the same time, it's that doesn't mean that we don't have senses that can take in data. It just means that we're limited by, just based on the sheer fact of our size and our position in this universe and stuff. There's certain limitations for that are kind of inherent.
So do you think senses are directly linked to a physical part of our body?
Depends on how you define sense. The traditional ones, yes.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Okay.
You asking me or Rachel?
Rachel.
Okay, so this is kind of what I was saying before. If we said that the sense is hearing, then we could say that it's linked to the ears because they take in sound waves. But if we want to be more specific with the senses, then they wouldn't necessarily be linked to just one body part. They'd be linked to a whole series of body parts, or maybe no one specific body part. So Steiner himself, he said that listening to words and becoming aware of their meaning is something quite different from hearing mere tone and mere sound. So he made this distinction that there are actually lots of different ways in which we sense sound. There's simply picking up the sound waves. There's making sense of volume and tone and pitch. There's being aware of kind of recognizing the familiarity of different sounds. And there's perceiving speech as opposed to just background noise or just noises. And then there's making sense of that speech and picking out words and understanding the meaning of those words. So there's kind of lots of different ways that, or rather, there's lots of different things that can come under this, umbrella of hearing. But some of them take place in the brain. Some of them take place purely in the ear. Some of them are just, one or two ear bones. Some of them rely on the ear and brain working together. So it's is hearing the sense, or is hearing part of the sense? Is language part of the sense? And so on and so on. Does this make sense?
I think
there's conflation going on. I was just going to say, because when you hear something, I would say that hearing, for example, as a sense, is auditory perception. You're just taking in what's around you. What you do with that, like whether or not it's just a sound that makes you think, oh, there's something going on in that bush, I'm going to react. I wouldn't call the reaction a sense. And if you just build up and make that more complicated, where language falls in, etc., I don't think it's right to call it a sense. It's predicated on sense. To some extent, depending on how you define language, because people that can't hear, they can communicate. That's a language. That's perfectly sufficient. But I should just say, as I've probably made clear already, I'm really out my depth here. I don't know enough about it, but it just so much of it seems arbitrary.
Yeah, I would have to kind of agree with Steve on this to some extent, because you can have parts of this damaged neurologically. So, for example, if you have someone who has Wernicke's aphasia, then basically the Wernicke's area is what interprets what the things that you hear and tries to make sense out of them. But there's no damage to your earring, to your hearing, to your eardrums, to the bones and whatnot that allow you to pick up the senses that are coming in. So like you still have those receptors; they're completely intact. The pathways are intact. Everything is like you're able to take in that qualia, but then you're not able to make sense of it. That's not a problem with your senses. That's a problem with it's a neurological problem with your perception of the senses once you have all of the data.
Yeah.
So like it'd be kind of like saying that you have a microphone that's able to, record and pick up the sound and everything, but then when it goes to write it into the computer, if there's a software issue and the software isn't able to actually record it in a digital format, then it's like it's the computer that's broken. It's not the hardware that's picking up the sound. You're listening to it through your ears, you're taking all this input, and then when it goes into the brain to try to make sense of it, then it's like, well, what the heck is this? So people with Wernicke's aphasia, they're not able to put together a comprehensive sentence in the sense that like they can't make sense of it. They're still fluent. They can still speak because unless they have a Broca's aphasia, which is like a different area of the brain, but like in that case, they're not able to put together like sentences that have any kind of proper syntax or something. But someone with Wernicke's aphasia, they can still talk, but what they put together doesn't make sense. So it might have perfect syntax. It might have these and A's and stuff in the right place, and their sentences sound like it could be English, but it doesn't really fit the situation. The words are off, and like they'll put words together sometimes that are kind of like, what the heck are they saying? Like it's not coherent. And that kind of leads me to think that like this isn't really a sense. This is more of a interpretation of the senses once you have them, and I draw a line there.
Yeah.
That's a really, really good point. I've got to say, I agree with you. I'm just trying to like present these arguments as though like I'm being impartial, Yeah. But I do have quite an interesting little sort of case study for you in relation to sense of smell. So how does your sense of smell work? Do you guys know that?
I have a very poor sense of smell.
That's okay.
Apart from certain things, it's very, very strange. Certain things, very, very strong. Lightning storm. I can smell that before it comes. Yeah, it's just it's awesome. It smells very, very, very clean. Burnt eggs. That reeks.
Gross.
So with smell, aren't you picking up certain particles that are in the air?
Yeah, you're basically picking up chemicals. And
so technically, if somebody farts, you're sniffing poop flakes, and it's like they put their poo inside you.
Yeah.
Oh God.
To our brand new listeners, you need to go check out the episode on antibiotics where we talk about fecal transplants.
Do you want to give them the quote again?
I'm good.
I really think you should.
Thomas Westbrook, put your poo inside me.
Amazing.
That'll be my campaign slogan.
You'll win.
God, guys, you're so childish, getting off topic.
Yeah, Thomas.
Alright, what was I? Yeah, no, the point I was going to make is when we talk about a sense of smell, what it is there are chemical receptors in your nose that are picking up chemicals and then sending signals to the brain, right? These are called olfactory receptors. You might have heard of them. And they're called this because, they were found in the nose. There are about 350 different kinds of them inside your nose. But what's interesting is they aren't just found in the nose. They're found all over our body. So there's about 150 kinds of them on our skin. They're also found in sperm cells. They're found in the heart, the kidneys, all over the body. The same kind of receptors as we get in the nose. The only difference is they're still responding to chemical stimuli. It's just we don't get a sense of smell out of it. We get other things. So, let me find an example here. Here we go. So, a 2003 study found that olfactory receptors in sperm cells function as a kind of guidance system to help them find unfertilized eggs. A 2009 study found that olfactory receptors help control metabolic function and regulate blood pressure in the kidneys of mice. And in 2014, a study found that olfactory receptors in the skin, when exposed to certain processes, can speed up the healing process of cuts and grazes on skin. So, these are the same receptors all over the body, taking in chemical stimuli, but reacting in very different ways. So, in the nose, we sense what we call odors. When they're in the skin, it can help us heal. In the kidneys, it can, help with metabolism. In sperm, it can help with fertilization. So in this sense, what would you say the sense is? Like, how do you define the sense of smell? Does this make sense? It kind of complicates things, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It's like we've called smell the way specifically our nose, basically how our nose takes that information, or more importantly, how our brain conceives that information coming from those receptors from the nose, because obviously it takes it as something else from other receptors. It does throw a spanner in the works.
It's still detecting chemical composition, is it not? In those various other areas?
Yeah.
But I think the hard thing then is, do you call all of these things
smell?
Smell.
Yeah.
Are they all your sense of smell? Or are we just going to basically arbitrarily say the ones in the nose we're going to call that, but the other ones that are evidently exactly the same, we'll just call that something else?
Well, but you can have a loss of a particular sense without having a loss of the receptors. So, like I said, there's different ways that you can lose certain abilities. So, you could still have fully functioning eyeballs, and your retina's fine and the iris is working just fine, and it's sending signals to your brain. But if, let's say, that the pathway to the occipital lobe is damaged, then you're not going to be able to see it. You're not really going to be able to make sense of anything that's coming in through your eyes, because it's just going to look black. Like you're not going to have a sense of sight. But that doesn't mean that the hardware or I guess I should be careful with my terms, but like it doesn't mean that your eyeballs are damaged. It means that the pathway to be able to then interpret what you're seeing is
the big question kind of is.
So I think you need both.
If you had that disconnect in the brain, but the eye still works, is the eye still sensing? Or in order to call it a sense, must it be connected to the brain? Must there be a consciousness, or even not even depending on how you define consciousness, something that can make something out of that data?
Yeah.
Or is it just sufficient to say that no, it's perceiving the world in some form? It doesn't matter if it's attached, because in that case, if you cut a onion, the onion reacts, hasn't got a brain, but you would have to call that a sense.
What's really interesting about the eyes is that in those cases where the eyeball still works and there's just the link to the occipital lobe that's not working, if the other pathways are still working, say to like the emotional center of the brain or something, if you, for example, put a picture of a smiling person in front of a person who's, got that wrong with their brain, they won't be able to tell you that it's a smiling person in front of them, but the emotional parts of their brain will still react the same as anyone else. So the information's still going in, it's just not conscious. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fascinating.
I feel like I didn't really describe that well, but it's a very interesting
You're talking about blind sight.
phenomenon. Potentially. Yeah. I don't know if it's got a name, but that sounds right.
So, it's called blind sight, and there's actually, you have two different pathways that when you see something, there's two different pathways that the input takes. The first is, from your brain kind of back to your occipital lobe, where it processes it and creates a visual interpretation of all of the things that your eyes are taking in. That's what you kind of see, like you're conscious of it. And then the other is it goes straight to kind of your brain stem. And it's much more reactionary. So oftentimes, like if you're kind of talking on the phone and thinking about something while you're driving, you're reacting to things that are visually coming in and to your lane position and someone who swerves in front of you. You're doing that very quickly and emotionally without necessarily being conscious of driving. And sometimes you can drive for, minutes or hours at a time without really paying attention to what's going on. And it's because you're using that separate pathway. And that's why you have people with blind sight who sometimes they're not conscious of what they're seeing, but they can still have movement, and they can tell if something's going up or down, and they might feel like they're guessing, but they're guessing with a high degree of accuracy, like 85% accuracy, because they're relying on kind of the reptile brain, or your brain stem. It's the oldest, most primitive aspect that, a reptile doesn't need to be able to kind of think about consciously, like, oh, that apple is beautiful and it's red and I can just really see it and I need to paint it and recreate it. Instead, it just sees like, oh, hey, there's movement that looks, I just react like it's a fly and I just eat it.
Yeah.
It's reactionary.
Do those people still have a sense of sight? Like, technically, they're still taking the light waves in. They're still doing something with the light waves.
I think the key
they
is
don't
in
have
how you phrased
image.
it. You phrased it as, do those people still have that sense?
Do they have a sense of sight?
A diminished, diminished sense.
No, you could say they don't have a sense of it, because what we would call they, going back to your episode on what is you, they being their consciousness, if we was to define it that way, which I understand we may not want to, they being their consciousness, they no longer have a sense of sight if the eyes are removed, and two, if there's a disconnect between the eyes and their consciousness. Going back to what you were saying about the emotional part, or the stem, which is really interesting, something that we touched on when we looked at free will is that, and lots of studies have shown this, information goes in and you emotionally have it way before your prefrontal cortex can do anything about it. And it takes a lot of effort and energy to be able to build on it. So one reason people get angry in cars is because that's one of the areas where they finally don't have to control themselves. They can just let themselves go. And that's really important. Like, we don't do that enough in society, and we need to, like, this is why people play gaming and they get angry at games. Why are you getting angry at games? They might not know it, but the reason is because it gives them a rest from having to basically live under complete tension of being able to control yourself. It allows you just to have that reactionary reptile brain going on. But I just wanted to throw that out there, basically, because the realization that everything comes in emotionally first is very important. And while a lot of the emotional stuff can make it through to the consciousness, where we can go, oh, I do see that, or I do feel that way,
not all
some
of
it does. Yeah, not all of it does. And as you just said, the question then is, to me, the physiological, I was going to say entity, but it's not, but the physiological thing, that is still sensing, but it would be wrong to say that person still has a sense of sight, because they don't.
I'd kind of have to make a distinction here, though, that, like, I would say that they still have some sense of sight. They just have a very diminished sense of sight. Because you can take away the other aspect of it. You could sever the connections between, your eyes and, your brain stem, and they may not have that quick, emotional reaction and stuff. And it would be very difficult for them to really function at the same level. So, like, let's say that you hold up pictures, and there's been studies where they do this with apes and chimps and stuff, as well as with humans, where you might have a snake that is hiding in, like, the bushes, and it's very well camouflaged. And you say, what's this a picture of? And they're like, oh, just a bunch of bushes. And, like, they don't consciously realize that there's a snake there. But there's a much quicker emotional response where you can actually take their galvanic skin response and measure their stress levels, the electric response in their skin, to see, like, are they freaking out or something? And there is a spike when there's like a hidden snake in the picture that they kind of subconsciously pick up on. And so there is a survival advantage there. Now, if you were to sever those connections, they'd still be consciously aware of something that they're visually seeing, but they'd still be, I would say that they have a diminished sense of sight. They're still taking in stuff. They're still able to consciously realize it. But just because someone isn't consciously seeing doesn't mean that they're not still perceiving some things through, their sense of vision.
I mean, I guess I don't want to speak for Rachel as well, but yeah, I see no problem with that. I thought the hypothetical was that there is a complete disconnect, in order to illustrate where the locus is, essentially. But yeah, you're right with what you just said.
But it's kind of like a gradient too, because as you get older, your vision becomes blurrier, especially if you're nearsighted. You start to not be able to see distant objects and stuff. Are those people missing their sense? No, it's just diminished. And there's, because you have
but what about when that goes all the way? Can they then say, I do not have a sense of sight?
Well, they could be legally blind and still see stuff in a blurry.
I know, but in the hypothetical, if you can, so somebody has, I have 20/20 vision, right? Presumably, I'm just going to assume, do one of you need glasses?
I do.
I wear contacts.
Okay, so does that? How would we use the language to convey that my eyes are better? Would we say that, or would we not even do that? Do we see the same thing, basically? It's just yours is diminished. Does that mean that you don't actually see the same amount as I do?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say I have a diminished sense of sight.
And if it went all the way...
If I take away the crutch, if I take away the contacts... then you actually can see better than me. And if we're driving at nighttime, you can see signs and read them a lot better than I can at a much greater distance.
So if we say, no, you can see, it's diminished. I would say that there's some things that you aren't able to see. Like there will be certain letters that you cannot see. Your vision, your physiological apparatus is just not equipped to bring that in. You can't receive that data. That sense isn't allowing you, and therefore you haven't seen it. And if you go further to where I'm not saying you haven't got a sense of sight, but if you go all the way where, let's just say in the hypothetical, you cannot see a thing, like it's gone, I think it's fair to say that you don't have a sense of sight anymore. Unless we have to redefine words. That's basically the point I was trying to get across. Because in the vast majority of cases and realistic cases outside of the hypothetical, you're right. It's going to be it's a diminished state. So you still see. It's just you still have a sense of sight.
Even if everything becomes completely blurry and all I can see is just like light and darkness, and I can see I'm walking towards light or I'm walking towards darkness or something. Like it's really, really crappy sight.
Yeah.
But it's still more advantageous than absolutely nothing at all.
Again, I'm not saying that's not the case. I'm just saying that there is a case. There are cases where the mind has a complete disconnect. The eyes may as well be physically removed, and would you count that as they do not have a sense of sight? That's basically the point I'm trying to convey.
Can I make a segue that might actually be really interesting?
Yeah, sure.
Is if you have something like, let's say a bat that is, they operate at nighttime in caves and they fly around and they have a perception of the world around them, the shape of walls and things based off of echolocation. Now, if they're actually, if they're taking in sound and just like with us, when light comes in to our eyes, it's bouncing off of objects, and those photons they're hitting the receptors in the back of our eyes and generating a kind of three-dimensional perception of the world around us. I don't know what it's like to be a bat.
But do we talk about sound or hearing?
But that's a good question. Is it vision for them if they're able to generate a 3D representation of the world around them and actually see and navigate a world and see walls? Like, does it look like to them what's going on in their brain when they're receiving these sound inputs back? Are they actually able to kind of see texture and see, they're not going to have color in the same way that we do, because, color is perceived because, certain wavelengths of light are absorbed and others are reflected. And so that's where we see color. But as far as texture and shape of objects and stuff, you know, what sounds are absorbed and what are not? Do they have like a richer sense of certain aspects of the world around them? Do they have kind of a representation, a three-dimensional spatial representation that's similar to vision that's actually being generated in their mind? And at that point, can you call it vision?
I see that as a redefinition of maybe not a redefinition. It's a different definition of sight. It's moving the goalpost in reference to the question that I had, if I'm honest. But it is a very interesting segue because vision is defined in so many ways, and if we define it in such a way, then yeah, that's totally sight.
I guess a kind of similar question I'd have is that, like, Stephen, you said you've got a terrible sense of smell, right? So let's assume that's because the olfactory receptors in your nose don't work properly.
Sure.
But what if they still work in your skin, in your kidneys, in your other body parts?
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of smell?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah.
Again, I'm out my depth. Just intuitively, I really wouldn't count that as a sense of smell. A sense of smell is... It doesn't matter if it's the same receptor, technically. What matters is the relationship it has to my consciousness. That's the way that I probably rudimentary look at it. Again, I don't know enough about it, so there's probably people that have done a lot of research into sense, and they might be thinking, God, this guy is ignorant. I'm being honest, like, I am ignorant to it. It's just, I don't see how... It's very hard to have... What I want is consistency. So it's all very well coming up with different... I was
going to say, but if that's the case, then surely you'd say that warmth and pressure are different senses. Because same receptors, different perception in the brain.
It's more about the relationship it has with my consciousness. So the reason I would say that smell comes from my nose would be because that's what those... We can call them atoms for the sake of it, because everything's an atom, essentially. Those atoms send data to my brain, my consciousness, and the way that we collectively call that, we say that's our sense of smell. We know it's located in the nose, for example. Whereas there's a different array of atoms in my ear, and they're constructed in such a way that they send different data to my brain, and we call that hearing. I recognize that is... basically subjective to it's subjective on a species level, perhaps we could say. And if we knew just what senses other organisms had, then we would have to use a completely different language. But
does it have to be conscious though for it to be a sense?
That's a good question. Because
there's some things that, you know, we're conscious of that you could argue are a sense that might get lumped in with other senses, but like a sense of hunger. You know, how hungry are you? You know, and
but that's a
depending on how hungry you are, there's subconscious reactions that your body has. You know, like when you smell a delicious steak that's, you know, or I guess not you, Steve, because you're a vegetarian. But when you smell something that's...
I mean, I would never knock meat for its taste. A lot of it's really tasty. The smell of a good steak, if I'm hungry, will make me hungry.
When you're hungry, it's like you start to salivate and you start to, like, you know, you get all excited at, you know, the thought of eating food, and your brain starts releasing dopamine at the prospect of, like, gorging on this delicious feast. But if you're stuffed full and you're absolutely just, like, about to pop, and suddenly you smell something that's delicious, then you don't have quite the same reaction. You're like, oh, I'm going to throw up. That's the last thing I want right now. But that's something that you're conscious of. But then you have other things that you sense that your brain picks up on that is completely outside the realm of what we notice.
Like,
so
about,
you might have someone...
Time is a big one. Like we have this
time, I think, like, we're somewhat conscious of, but like I would think more like, if let's say that someone walks in the room and maybe it's an undetectable level, but maybe they slightly remind you of someone who was, you know, abusive in the past to you, or that yelled at you or something, and you don't make that connection consciously, but your heart rate increases slightly.
Okay.
Are you know, you're sensing something, you're detecting something, there's stress, there's anxiety that's going on, there's your heart rate is picking up, there's even a response, a physiological response to it, but it's not conscious.
I think this is a good point. It really is. I think it kind of comes down to the way in which we view consciousness. if consciousness means that you need to have knowledge of it, you need to understand, then yeah, I think that you obviously can sense things without that definition doesn't work. But the way some people define consciousness would mean that humans are the only thing that are conscious, maybe other great apes. But I would say that a bearded dragon is conscious. I would say that an insect is conscious. It's just to varying degrees, and what those degrees can achieve and exactly how they interact with their environment is a different question. But if you were saying that you just see someone that reminds you of, or they do something that reminds you of someone that you don't like subconsciously, and you just naturally just have a tone where you don't like that person, and this is true whether or not you're conscious of it, to use the key word. Of course, that's still falling into senses. You are sensing it and you're reacting in that way. But I don't think you need to have knowledge necessarily in order to consider it consciousness. But in saying that, I think that might undo some of the other points I've said within this, which just goes to say that I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about.
It is way more complicated than, like, you'd think.
It is.
You're taught as a kid, you're like, oh, you have 5 senses. It's like, eyes for seeing, ears for hearing, but then, you grow up a bit and realize there's so much more going on. And if we are just taking sense to mean, like, a detection of information, then there's so much more it could be. But then it's like, do we have to be conscious of it? Do we not? How does, like, the relationship with what's happening in the brain, like, where does that come into it? It's just, there's so much to it.
I think what we do with the information, calling that a sense, I intuitively don't like that. So, for example, we use our senses and then we use it in a certain way, in a certain combination. We go, oh, that's language. Well, that's a sense. No, I don't think it is. I think you could apply the reductio ad absurdum technique and show that, well, basically everything then becomes a sense. I don't think that's doable. But yeah, you're completely right. It is so much more complicated than you would think. It's very easy just to function, since we're normally communicating with humans, with the way we perceive the world. And I think it's relatively fair to say we've got 5 senses. But there's a big elephant in the room, and that is the 6th sense. The detection of ghosts and other made-up bullshit.
Hey, it's not made up. I totally have that sense. Definitely.
Yeah, Rachel went to a psychic once.
No, that was Steve.
Oh, that was Steve.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went.
Rachel
is
the psychic. That's why she didn't need to go.
Yeah.
True story.
I just speak to all my ghosts myself. The doctors tried telling me they were just imaginary friends, but we don't trust
that
them.
everyone can talk to the dead. You should be concerned when the dead talk back.
Nice.
But I kind of on that note though, like, of how many senses do we have? I don't know that, like, that's really difficult to pin down. If you're talking about physical sensations, even then it starts getting kind of a little bit sketchy, a little bit gray as to, which ones do you lump into the same area, but it's still, I would say it's very safe to say that we have more than 5. Because even something like sensing temperature, that's like you have, sensations all over your body that are able to kind of detect it, even when you're not touched, even when you're not physically, it gets colder in the room and you can detect that the temperature changed.
Is that true? So, for example, you feel more pain on your fingertips, because there's a lot of pain receptors, than you do on certain other parts of your anatomy. Say the bottom of your foot. Although that might be a bad example because it's normally full of calluses. But let's just say something else. We can even just go with the back of your hand. Actually, no, that's a bad example as well. There's somewhere, maybe your thigh. When you apply heat to both areas, if the fingers, which I suspect hurt or react or feel the heat much quicker than the other part that you test it upon, you can kind of argue it's the same sense. It's a different way of stimulating it.
Oh, but by that definition, everything is touch. So like when photons are touching the back of your eyeball, that's a sense of touch. when certain particles are touching your olfactory receptors. That's touch. You know, like it's when you taste certain objects, it's coming in contact with them. That's touch. Like it's technically everything is touch then. But it's you don't just say I have one sense, the sense of touch. It's like no, you have different sensations. Like as your body gets colder or hotter, internally or externally, it can lead to you know, sweating or, you know, trying to to try to cool off and regulate your body temperature, or shivering and trying to warm you up. You know, I think it'd be a bit of a stretch to say that temperature is a sense of touch.
Yeah.
So like one way or another, I think like with all these other additional senses, like it'd be really hard to say that even if you just take it as like a physiological external sensation, some type of external qualia that your body is detecting and picking up on, then I think it's you can't say that we just have 5. But at the same time, if you say that it's much more than that, and a lot of it is psychological, and it's or not just psychological but neurological, that you're detecting, you know, speech and making sense of it, and trying to, or detecting time, and like when you put, you know, your time is basically just like you're detecting abnormalities or changes from 1 second to the next. So you're like the vision, or the things that I'm seeing visually, they're constantly changing and fluctuating. The things that I'm hearing are changing from 1 second to the next. And so we kind of generate this sense of time, but that sense of time is kind of happening in the mind.
Yeah.
You know, it's just a bunch of still, you know, instances, little slivers, slices in time that are all, you know, kind of seem static, but you put them all together and it's like a movie, it's like a motion picture, but your brain is putting it all together and coming up with this coherent sense of time. You know, but is that strictly in the brain? Is that a sense? Even by that definition, I'd say it'd be, by both definitions, it's safe to say we have more than 5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm getting off on all kinds of tangents here. Rachel,
No.
I'm steering you off course.
No, that's fine. Like I was kind of getting ready to wrap up anyway. It's all good. And the only kind of like other one I'd kind of like to discuss are these slightly like intangible ones that Steiner put forward. So like this idea of thought being a sense, like basically it's described as being able to perceive thoughts in our own mind, so kind of like our consciousness. So it's like the fact that, you know, like when you talk to yourself, you can like hear yourself in your head. Like, is that a sense? It's kind of intangible. No one else can pick up on it. There aren't really anything, it's not really anything physical in terms of like sound waves or anything like that, but it's still there and we still perceive it, and it's still essentially data. So yeah,
it's like in having this conversation, and of course coming into it as somebody that hasn't spent anywhere near enough time researching the topic, I've realized that it's very hard to have a coherent definition which doesn't lead to absurdities.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I don't know is the best answer for me.
Rachel, would that just be self-awareness? Because it's generated in the mind, but it's you kind of being conscious about, it's like metacognition. You're conscious about consciousness. You're aware of what you're thinking about. So your brain is processing all this stuff and generating these scenarios of like future actions, or, you know, how would I have done that differently? Or what would I say to this person now? And it's generating these movies in your head, but it's just kind of, you're able to sense, you're able to detect what your brain is processing. You're able to kind of take a step back. Would that be safe to say? It's like a sense of metacognition or of self-awareness.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
I mean, in a sense, it kind of is. In a sense, it kind of is a sense. Because you look at the animal kingdom and like they lack that ability, that, you know, those layers of abstraction are not there.
And like plants definitely don't have that.
There are some animals that are self-aware that they are a separate entity from others, and they've done tests on this where they'll like put a mirror up to like an elephant or something, and they'll put like a red dot on the elephant's face, and instead of it reaching out to the mirror or something, it like looks in it and it recognizes that that is itself, and it'll reach up and touch the spot on its own face.
I see.
And they've done tests like this on babies and on apes and on pigs, and like they found that a number of animals that, you know, more intelligent animals possess this, but most don't. And most humans, well, all humans, they develop this ability at around, I think it's like the age of 2 or 3.
Yeah,
where they start to.
3, isn't it?
So I've got a slight problem with that test. You know, you were saying about how we've all evolved. Basically, all species have evolved different capacities to sense the world around them, and that's true even if we're very closely related. So mammals that are, you know, nocturnal, their sight is going to be slightly differently calibrated to ours. Are we sure that there is a reflection at all to some of the animals that we put in front of it? We just assume, it seems, that that's the case with certain animals, especially, say, insects, or, I mean, it's probably a bad example, but, you know, certain reptiles. How can we know whether or not there is, whether or not the methodology is sound, whether or not they can actually see themselves in the first place?
Well, like,
sure, they
I guess
react,
with
but
most
you
mammals,
can't...
they have at least rod or cone cells, which do pick up light, so we know that from their eyes.
Oh, yeah, so we know that they pick up,
And
but it's to
you
do
can
with exactly
detect-
how the mirror works, the particular combination of glass and, you know, what's behind it. If you get that wrong
Mirrors are
by a
just
bit, you
reflecting
can...
light waves.
It's just the photons bouncing off. You can pick it
Yeah.
up in cameras. You can
Yeah.
detect it. Just, you know.
I see.
The laws of physics apply to mirrors equally, regardless of who's perceiving it.
Yes, but so, you know, we were saying that whether we like it or not, the laws of physics right now are showing ultraviolet and infrared.
Mm-hmm.
But the question I'm asking is whether or not they have the evolved sense to perceive it in the first place. I know they have the sense to see, but it might be that there's a particular wavelength which actually means that they struggle very much to see a reflection, under which conditions we can see very well. That's basically the point I'm just trying to convey. I'm not saying that they're going to be fundamentally different.
Part of it is you can measure this by, like, do they react to things in the mirror? So, like, a cat, if you put another cat in front of the mirror, it freaks the heck out. Like, it'll get angry and bad at it.
Kyra
if you
hates
put, like,
the mirror.
2 iguanas or an iguana in front of a mirror, it'll, like, see the other iguana and it might, like, posture up in this intentional stance of, like, you know, I'm gonna destroy you or something.
Yeah.
So they're able to, they respond to it, they see it, they react like it's another iguana.
Like, it might not be that case. It might be they can't distinguish what it is. Like, because of the particular wavelength, they can see something and their reaction is to get aggressive. But we can't really know for certain, and that's not what I'm appealing to. It's more, we don't have this as a definitive answer because of that limitation. But the fact that a cat reacts, that tells us that a cat can see something and it doesn't like it and it reacts. It doesn't tell us that it can see another cat itself and that it interprets that cat as not itself. We can't.
But you can actually
take.
You can actually do brain scans of a cat's brain and compare them to, you know, how does it react when it sees things around it? What is going on, like, in its brain when you know, close its eyes? What happens in a blind cat's brain versus a cat that can see? And you can see what all lights up. And, like, in a mirror,
have studies been done using that with the mirror?
I don't know with a mirror.
And the other thing is if you look at the brain of a cat when it sees another cat that it gets startled by, and you look at what parts of the brain light up when they see a dog or just something else that scares them, I imagine the response is almost identical. And so again, you can't actually tell anything from that other than it saw something and it reacted in a scared way. Maybe I mean, tell me if I'm being obtuse here, because it might be the case, but
all I'm saying
or if
is,
I'm being
like,
hyper skeptical, perhaps that's the case.
The
It's
the physics of a mirror, it is not, like, altering the photons; it's reflecting them. That's all. So, it's still reflecting the same amount of.
I'm not doubting that at all.
So, like, if a cat is able to react to another cat in the real world, and it's able to tell what another cat looks like, then it would be able to tell through a mirror versus in reality. Like, that's not going to change it. But right. if it's like an iguana, for example, it lacks the pathway that we have to the occipital lobe to necessarily generate an image. So like, yeah, iguanas, whether or not they have actually kind of a conscious visualization of the world or just some type of blind sight, like you could argue that. In which case it's probably unlikely if they even lack the ability to visually perceive things, that, you know, that their brains are much more primitive, then they're not going to have the consciousness of, or the self-awareness that a human has, because they lack the hardware. They lack the higher level brain structures that form in animals that are able to do that, to notice what's going on. And this happens as, like, for example, a toddler, not just the mirror test. You can do other tests on kids where you ask them questions. You say something like, you give them a test where, you know, this person is, you know, leaves the room and somebody, you know, puts something under, you know, an object under two hats. And then, you know, does this person know which hat it's under? And the kid will be like, oh, yes, of course, it's under that hat. And they're not able to kind of make this distinction at a super young age that other people know and are aware of different things than they are. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, they don't have this theory of consciousness, this theory of, you know, they're not self-aware enough to realize that, like, it's a separate entity. That person is a separate entity than them. Until a certain age, as those neural structures grow and develop, then they acquire this ability. And those structures just don't exist in reptiles. So,
you see, I agree with pretty much everything you said there, but I do not think we can definitively say that about reptiles, because it's based on assumptions, good assumptions, good enough to say that there's really good reason to think that they can't see themselves. They don't really know, that they're not conscious in that way. But I don't think we can go all the way with the tests that we have currently done and the ones that you've just mentioned. But you're right. You know, I'm not knocking at all that we know that there needs to be a certain amount of capacity in certain regions of the brain in order to be able to recognize yourself. You know, we've seen elephants do it. We've seen chimpanzees do it. We've seen humans do it once they hit a certain age. And that tells us a hell of a lot. But my question more pertained to assuming that their senses function the same as ours and that they will react to the same kind of conditions that we would.
I mean, the physics is the same.
Yeah, the physics is the same. I'm not knocking the physics.
The neurons and stuff, like, they operate the same way. The chemistry is the same. And if you take these specific regions in a human's brain or in a chimp's brain and you damage them, either through a stroke, you know, some type of hypoxia or like lack of oxygen, or you have, you know, a traumatic injury that happens to the brain, like a physical injury, or even if you sever some of the pathways in, like, the case of like a lobotomy, or if you remove a particular chunk of the brain, then you can see what abilities we lose and what, you know, we and you can either talk to people or you know, if they lose the ability to speak, you can see like, oh, well, what happened, what was damaged. You can scan their brains and stuff, and so like,
and then they really don't recognize themselves in the mirror, right? So we can
we can map function onto you know, the brain itself.
Yeah,
and it's easier with some things than others. So, for example, self-awareness and consciousness, that's a little bit harder because, like, I don't know that there's one specific, you know, locus in your brain that is like, that is, you know, there's kind of a general, like, I think the frontal, maybe it's not the frontal lobe. I'm talking
prefrontal cortex.
I don't. Oh yeah, but prefrontal cortex is massive, and I don't know that that's even. I think it more has to do with your spatial awareness to a large extent, and I want to say that is more like your SPL, your superior parietal lobe. It gives you kind of like a polysensory representation of like your body image in space, and like but I don't know. Again, like, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm more of a hobbyist, but when I do know that there are specific functions that are mapped onto specific regions of the brain. And so like when you get rid of these regions or you damage these regions, you lose this ability. So like when you look at animals that don't have any of these regions, but they have the other parts, like, so like the brain stem that we have is also, you know, prevalent in reptiles, and you can learn what those different functions do and what happens when you remove them. And so, you know, is it possible that reptiles have used these same regions to kind of develop a new sense? Possibly, but you're going really, you're taking it really far, because like, in order for us to be able to have these senses, like, you have to have a greater surface area. Some of them require like a lot more, you know, connectivity and a lot more like, I don't know. I think you'd be
let me
really
make my
far
point
stretched to prove
one
that.
more way, just because either I'm not communicating properly, which is likely the case, or I'm not communicating properly. So when it comes to a human, if a human has a damaged part of the brain, they no longer recognize themselves in the mirror. Let's assume that. That means that we can conclude that it's something to do with that part of the brain that allows humans to be able to perceive themselves, to recognize themselves. We can make that correlation with very high reasonability. To then say that because other beings don't have that part in their brains, therefore they cannot see themselves, or therefore they are not self-aware, more importantly, that isn't a jump we can logically make. That you can't do that. So, for example, it could be the case that a certain insect can actually recognize itself, but when we set it up under the parameters that we use, which is in front of a mirror, it might be that one of their senses interferes in such a way that it's just it's never going to be able to see itself or recognize itself. So it might be with an insect, the specific way that ultraviolet rays come in and react with particles that are there but we can't conceive, make it so that they don't react, or that they react hostilely because they can't make out what it is, because that sense in that way is getting in the way. Therefore there may be other ways in order for consciousness to be what it is. It's like we know, just as we know eyes have evolved numerous times, and yet we can see differences in those eyes, and we wouldn't say, right, this is what an eye is, therefore all other species that don't have this particular faculty or this particular part can't see. We can't do the same with consciousness. It's a complicated matter, and I can't rule out, based on what we know so far, that other beings can't consciously know that don't consciously know that they exist. I think it's very unlikely. I'm not saying anything more than that. It's just, that's basically the point I was trying to get across. Maybe it was a bit too pedantic, but I think that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. Well, and we're going to dive more into this in, I guess we were recording this episode second, but hopefully I will have dove more into this in last week in my episode on, we're recording both at the same time, but hopefully I would have covered this a little bit more in the mind-body dualism episode.
Yeah.
It confuses me when we record out of order.
I'm sorry. And no, I do think this is kind of like a good place to wrap up today, though.
Sure.
But my final question to you guys is, do we have a 6th or 7th or 8th or 9th sense? Or, 20th sense? Like, if you had to put a guess, like a number, on how many senses we have, what would you say?
I would say I don't know. I think that's what I would say.
Very accurate.
And just to the audience, I was just going to say, I feel like I've been obtuse this video, this conversation, or failing to communicate myself. Apologies if that's the case, but yeah, it's been an interesting one to wrap my head around.
It's definitely tough. This is definitely an episode where I don't have any answers. There's so many variables and things that it's so hard to define, and I don't think there necessarily is a right or a wrong answer, because even just the idea of a sense is something that we've kind of created ourselves. So it's not like when you look at like particles and you're like, either it's an electron or it's a proton or it's a neutron. It's not like an either or. It's like, does this make sense? Like, the idea of if something is a sense or not isn't just a yes or no kind of thing, because there's so many...
It depends on man-made definitions, which are so arbitrary.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. My words aren't coming out right.
Yeah, I mean, in response to your question a second ago, I honestly can't say how many senses we have. It depends on how you define senses, and then even then there's some that, you know, it becomes really hazy.
Yeah.
But I do think that we have more than 5, and I think that hopefully this episode has really opened up people's eyes to like just how complicated the field of neuroscience can be, and how it's a brand new field of study, and we're learning new things every day. And I would encourage our listeners to go read up on this stuff, read more, learn more, study it, and hopefully become scientists, and maybe you can contribute to the next realm of, or the next round of breakthroughs and understanding.
There is so much potential in neuroscience, and yet we have the most rudimentary of understanding, and yet already it's completely... The discoveries that have been made in it are fantastic. They are world-altering, and yet we know still like basically nothing. So that's a good field to get into.
Imagine if we learned more and more and more about how the senses work, and it allows us to augment our senses even better. It allows us to, you know, to see in the dark and to, you know, be able to sense and detect things that we're just not equipped to do. And if you're able to create some cool technology or cure some illness, or if people are have their senses damaged and you're able to find a way to, you know, fix that or correct that, or, you know, there's a lot of ground to be made there.
What I think's really cool about this topic is that when you say something like, oh, the senses, everyone thinks it's such a basic thing, you know, you learn it at such a young age, and you're like, oh, okay, it's simple, that's all there is to it. But it's one of those things where when you look into it, you realize how kind of vast and how much depth there is to it, and how much we still don't know. And it's kind of one of those things where you realize, you know, there's so much more we can learn, and it's one of those kind of like never stop learning kind of things, because things are never as simple as they seem.
I like your slogan better than put your poo in me.
Yeah,
Rachel Oates, never stop learning.
God, it sounds like
although
my old
I think
school
maybe
motto.
I'll stick with the other one, and was it last week's episode or the one before? I am the storm.
Yeah.
Oh, seriously, it sounds like my old school motto, which was never stop flying. It was so cheesy. We all hated it.
Yeah.
Oh, it was really bad. We because my school was really old, and it was founded in like 1390 something, I think. Sorry. And the old school badge had these little birds on it, and the birds didn't have feet. So the idea was, like, you never just sit down and settle, you always keep going and keep trying and keep achieving. And it had some old Latin motto. And then when my school got demolished and rebuilt, because for funsies, it was falling apart, they decided to update the school motto to never stop flying. And everyone just, like, took the mick out of it, and it was absolutely ridiculous. And we all ridiculed it. But I prefer, you know, never stop learning. That's a nice one.
Did you say your school was founded in 1390?
Yeah.
Your school is older than my country.
Mm-hmm.
You're a young country, Thomas.
And it's still one of the crappiest schools in Britain.
Well, they've had long enough. What's wrong with them?
No, seriously, I googled it the other year, and apparently it's like one of the top 10 lowest funded schools in the country. I was like, oh, okay. That explains a lot.
Here's a bit of trivia for you. The school that I went to on the Isle of Wight was the lowest in Europe.
Lowest funded or lowest?
It was lowest
scoring?
For grades. It was just a terrible school. It doesn't exist
well, that says a
anymore.
lot.
I know, it says it all, doesn't it?
I have another little bit of trivia.
Explains everything, Steve.
Well, here's one for you.
It explains why you have AIDS. It explains why you don't last long in the bedroom.
Exactly. If my school answers why I don't last long in the bedroom, that's interesting.
A bit worrying. I've got a fun fact, though. My school was the same school that Nicholas Saunderson went to.
I don't know who that is.
Like, crazy famous mathematician. He was really, really important. What was the thing that he did? It was, You'll know it. Shut up.
Really important, Rachel. Come on.
He was one of the earliest discoverers of Bayes' theorem. There you go.
Oh,
I thought
okay.
I thought that was Bayes.
No. Nicholas Sanderson. He's a very
That's like
interesting
saying-
guy.
That's like saying I was one of the 21st century discoverers of Newton's theories of gravitation.
No, he worked in like the 1600s, so he's old. He's very old. What else did he do? He did lots of like mathsy stuff, and he worked a lot with calculus and some other stuff. And he was an interesting guy. Algebra. He did stuff with algebra. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is from Wikipedia. The discovery of Bayes' theorem remains a controversial topic in the history of mathematics. While it's certain to have been discovered before Thomas Bayes' time, there are several contenders for the priority, including Saunderson.
Oh,
very well.
Yeah,
Nicely.
there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, sharp.
Bitches! Take that!
Yeah.
No, we always got told, like, what a cool guy he was, and we were always told about, like, oh, Nicholas Saunderson went here, but no one ever really knew what he did. So
He
it
had
was
slaves.
See, I think it would be cool to like go back in time and like discover things that, before they were discovered.
Like discover the past so you can
You
create
know,
the future.
you can
yeah?
do that right now. There's still a lot of things we don't know.
Well, I know, but like,
Or do you
what
just
I'm
want to go
saying
back
is,
and
like,
discover, like, simple stuff?
if like, let's say that you go back 2,000 years and you're like, germs cause diseases, wash your hands, like
you would be crucified
God.
by the church.
No, you'd be a
yeah,
god.
it almost makes me wonder if you would progress science and scientific discovery like way faster, or if people just aren't ready for it and you'd be like Bruno and you'd just be like burned at the stake for your heresy.
We kind of know the answer because there were people that were that smart and they were burnt. Crap loads of people just. The entire culture was built around ignorance and retaining ignorance, except not entire, but a large part of it. And yeah, so we already kind of know what would happen. It would be like, can you not say that, Darwin? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, can you not speak about heliocentrism, please? We don't want that.
If the Catholic Church had a mascot, it would be the ostrich with its head in the sand.
Okay, yes.
Anyways, we probably should wrap this up.
Yeah, pretty much. Do you wanna end this? Because I don't know how to do it. Other than I've just realised why my school science block was called Saunderson.
That, and we don't really have a tagline. We'll see you all next week, where Steve will talk about
something
Steve stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Steve stuff. That's what's
stuff.
going to happen.
He's going to give us.
Do you know what topic? Do you know what topic, Steve?
Oh no.
Steve, why's it got to be white, huh?
Racist.
Alright, well, peace all.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
This has been an absolute blast, and now we want you to join in the conversation over on the Here and How Facebook and Twitter pages, or follow us on Pinterest and Instagram if you just want some of the dankest of sciencey memes. If you like one of our particular styles, check out each of our YouTube channels: Rachel Oates, Rationality Rules by Stephen Woodford, and Holy Kool-Aid by me, Thomas Westbrook. To find all of our episodes, show notes, contact information, and more, warp on over to our home base, thehereandhow.com. If you enjoyed this episode and want us to succeed in spreading the love of science, you can help us out by giving us a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher. And to all our friends and family listening, thank you for spending this episode with us. We'll be back to explore another exciting big idea next week. Now go create something magnificent.